Thanks for joining us. Secretary Kendall needs no introduction, but we'll give him anything else. Secretary of the Air Force. Previous Undersecretary of Acquisition,
Technology
Acquisitions and Logistics, right,
Yeah.
ATL. The last person to hold that very big job before they split it up. All right, and then end up in the Air Force. Well, thanks for joining us. We're going to have a little conversation, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So think of your questions now. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. Or Secretary Kendall will actually. But why don't we start with, since it's a focus of yours, obviously, just talking about how you're reorienting the Department of the Air Force and Space Force with this great power competition in mind.
Sure. I came into office just about 3 years ago now, knowing that we had to make some decisions, some choices about modernization. And I've been following the threat, since 2010, and it was clear to me that we had to respond aggressively to what China in particular was doing on the modernization front. So we did the operational imperative work, and we got that into our budget, and we moved forward with that. But over the first couple of years I was in office, it became clear to me in conversations with a lot of our field commanders and with the chiefs and with others that the chiefs of the services, that there were other things we needed to change beyond just how we're equipping the force. We had to look at how we're organized, we had to look at how we trained, we had to look at our posture in general. And my 20 or so years of Cold War experience included working in a very competitive environment with institutions in all the military departments that were oriented on the driving threat and being competitive against that threat. And also ready to go to combat, to go to war if it happened on short notice. And over the 30-odd years of post-Cold War period, we had first of all had about a decade of essentially not having threats. Then we had 20 years or so dealing with counterinsurgencies and counterterrorism. And so through that period, we gradually evolved away from the sort of things that you need to have institutionally to be competitive against a peer competitor. So the re-optimizing is a word we chose for that new environment, which has emerged. It's not a future environment, it's a current environment. China's well along the path of modernizing their military with the purpose of having a military that can defeat the United States. And Russia, of course, has demonstrated their aggressive tendencies here in Europe. So we took a look at, we took several months, we took 4 or 5 months to do, call it a sprint, if you will, but we organized teams to look at all aspects of the department. How we're organized to be competitive, how we do acquisition. Andrew Hunter is very involved in that. How we create a pipeline of new capabilities that is efficient at bringing modern technology and cost-effective applications into the department across the functions that we do. We did this for both the Air Force and Space Force. We looked at how we're preparing our units for the possibility of a conflict that could come very quickly. How we're training our people, what sense of expertise we want our people to have, and how we promote people to have the types of skill sets that we need in an era of great power and competition. So out of that came the 24 decisions we announced. And they're all moving forward. It's been a few months now since we announced them. With every week or two, we announce steps for make progress on this. The Hill has asked us to provide them with advance notice of our decisions. We do that. They've asked for 30 days to consider things before we implement. And we've got a pretty steady stream of things going up there that's all have been fine so far. What we're doing is eminently logical, I think, and I haven't seen any real pushback on the substance. There will be some cost. We've identified those now, and we're going to include those in our 26 budget. There will be some movement, but we want to minimize that of people around as we set up new organizations. We don't need legislative authority to do the things that we're doing. We checked on that before we started, so we're not concerned about that. But we're working in close cooperation with the Congress because they're interested in this for a variety of reasons, and we want their support. So we've been talking about them throughout, and we're going to continue this. The two service chiefs are very much behind this, and I'm leaving it to them generally to implement the parts of it that are in their two services, and the undersecretary and I are focusing more on some of the secretariat steps that we're taking. Together, we're doing monthly reviews of progress across the suite of things to make sure we're on track and to break down any obstacles. I told the team, Eric, when we started this, I don't want to move at the speed of bureaucracy, I want to move at the speed of leadership. and that's what we're doing. So it's moving forward pretty well. I think it's the right set of things to do. We've really not had any serious pushback on all this.
Are there any of these efforts that are proving more difficult than you'd imagined? Or any resistance inside the building or from other services?
No, not really. An example is we're breaking up our 826 into two separate staff offices. The intelligence and the communications related specialties, there's some overlap, but they're very different things with different expertise. So we're breaking that up. They're getting good cooperation on that from both communities. Creating more officers for cyber and IT was an interesting exercise. I think initially there was some reluctance to recreate. We already have the authority in the law to have more officers. We just haven't done it for decades. So that's the first class has been picked and is getting ready to start school here. Some of the organizational things, I just approved an organizational charter for one of the secretariat offices this morning. So it's all moving forward, I think, pretty smoothly. A couple of the items are delayed a little bit, but not in a major way.
You've talked, as a part of this, changing how the Air Force exercises. Can you talk about that a little bit?
My Cold War experience again was that it was routine for a unit to be, come to work one day and an inspection team essentially would show up and say, okay, you're on the op plan to go do this, show us you're ready. And you'd have to go do an exercise on short notice or no notice to demonstrate your readiness to do your mission. And that kept everybody on their toes. It meant the commanders had to focus on their ability to do that. And if you failed one of those exercises, there were pretty significant consequences for the unit. So we're gonna go back to things. I don't want to panic anybody in uniform in here that we're gonna do this every day with everybody, but we want our readiness-oriented commands to be focused on readiness, to be evaluating and building readiness as their primary, in fact, essentially their sole responsibility, so that if a conflict does occur, they're as ready as they can be.
And how, you've identified, I think it's 4 modernization priorities.
Only 4?
Only 4, yeah. How is this great power competition reorientation impacting your investment plan for the Air Force, Department of Air Force?
The fact of having a peer competitor, more than one, you could argue Russia's in that category too. But China's more formidable by far than Russia in terms of their conventional warfare competitiveness. At the moment, Russia's a greater nuclear power, but China is well on their way to becoming comparable to Russia. The changes in the threat, the changes in technology are behind what we do with the operational imperatives and what we call the cost-cutting operational enablers. So there are a total of 7 operational enablers, and 4, it's growing, maybe 5 now, cost-cutting operational enablers, and we're putting money into each of those. Some of them will field some capabilities very quickly. The one that is easiest to implement, is pretty straightforward, is increasing the resiliency of our bases, particularly in the Pacific, but also in Europe. And also acquiring the things that we need to be able to do agile combat employment, which is the concept that we won't just sit in our well-identified big base that we're on, but we'll get our forces off in a hub and spoke way is the way we describe it, to other bases and move them around so that they're harder to target and dilute the other side's targeting capabilities. So those were things we could do very quickly. The first increment of uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft is coming down the pike. It's on contract now, and we'll be moving forward that and getting that in production in just a few years. And now we're starting to work on the next increment to follow that. So again, it's the speed of, we use the term speed of relevance. It'd be relevant to have these things today, but we're moving as fast as we can to get things in the hands of our operators. I've given Andrew and Frank Calvelli on the space side the guidance that I want program structure to deliver meaningful military capability, which means at some scale, as quickly as possible. And so that's how we're trying to structure our programs.
How is, so the budget's projected to lose purchasing power, and as you're trying to make these change and really lean into reorientation to the Pacific, Indo-Pacific, how are you balancing your priorities for readiness, modernization, these changes you want to make?
We've been on an interesting journey here. I'm working on my 4th budget at the moment. When I came into office, the 23 budget was due the Air Force's proposed budget was due downstairs to the Secretary of Defense's office for review 2 days after I arrived, July of 21. I asked the Deputy Secretary if I could have a couple of weeks to take a look at my budget before we submitted it. And she said, well, go ahead and submit it, but take 2 weeks and make whatever changes you want after 2 weeks. So this was sort of my introduction to the Air Force, and I got to know each other through this process. It was really interesting and a lot of fun for everybody. Sarcasm there, but anyway, we made a bunch of changes to be compliant with the planning guidance we've been given. The budget that was handed to me when I walked in the door wasn't fully compliant. And to do that, we had to make a number of hard choices. And those took the form of reducing a lot of, I'll call it legacy force structure, to pay for the things we need, that we've been told to do, actually. So consultation with Secretary Austin, Deputy Secretary, and the President led to a substantial increase in our budget. And we were able to, keep the Air Force we have basically while starting to do some of the things we need to do for the future. The second budget I did, 24, was after we had done the operational imperative work, and it was informed by our need for modernization and the things we had done the analysis to identify as priorities. We identified on the order of $100 billion over the 5-year plan, an additional funding that we needed. And I could only fund a small fraction of that within the Air Force and the Space Force. So we laid that case on the table for the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy. We went through several months of conversations with that. And at the end of the day, they funded all of the things within that $100 billion, about $40 billion of it, that we considered essential to be successful. And I thought that was terrific. That was the first $5 billion roughly that's in the 24 budget that's already been passed just recently, that got the operational imperative moving work going forward. In 25, we were limited by the Physical Responsibility Act. So we had to do the best we can. And the trade-offs we made there, this is not 100% accurate, but it's close enough. We had to maintain the current force that the combatant commanders depend upon. There's a big fixed cost associated with that. We continued some of the divestitures that we had started. We're trying to do a few more. But we scaled back production of things we've already developed and have in the pipeline. We scaled back both F-15EX and F-35 in order to protect the modernization from the operational imperative work. So in 25, the budget that the Hill is looking at right now, there's about $6 billion to continue that work that we had started in 24. This was not for us an ideal situation, but we were bound by the Physical Responsibility Act. And so we made those trade-offs. If it continues at the flat level, we're not going to be able to get the growth that we need. We're kind of running out of trade space, basically. So 26 is just starting. We've got a long way to go on 26. I can't tell you what we're doing internally, that's pre-decisional. But we've set the stage. I just briefed the Deputies Management Action Group, the budget committee that oversees the budget for the department, the day I flew out here last Thursday. And so we started the conversation. I think we made some reasonable trades in there, but there is definitely a need for more resources if we're going to have the Air Force and Space Force. We're going to need to be competitive, and that's a conversation that I think will carry on into the next term, whichever candidate wins.
Part of your reorientation includes standing up the Integrated Capabilities Command.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and
Sure.
What gap you were filling?
It was in part filling a gap that I recognized when I came in, that I didn't have any institutional organization whose mission it was to be planning the future, and particularly one that brought together the combination of operational people and technologists or acquisition people. So I brought in Tim Grayson from DARPA. He's my chief system engineer, basically, and we formed teams around each of the 7 operational imperatives. Space Order Battle, Integrated Battle Management, Command and Control, Moving Target Indication, Air and Surface Moving Target Indication, Air Superiority, Air-Based Resilience, Global Strike, and protection of our assets that we count on to mobilize and deploy. Those were the 7 problems we attacked. In each case, we put together a team that was a combination of acquisition and operational people to lead that effort, to lead those studies, if you will. We also, I also took Luke Cropsey, And I didn't have anybody who was responsible organizationally for planning, executing, and overseeing technically our integration C3 battle management effort. ABMS is the Advanced Battle Management System. And I wanted to have both the Space Force and the Air Force battle management systems and all the things that go with it developed as an entity, as a whole. There was no organization that was in place that I could do that. I created Luke's new PEO, Program Executive Officer, for that purpose. So these are some of the things. The fact that I had to do ad hoc organizations to do something that should have been institutional purpose was one of the things that told me we need to re-optimize. We need to go think about our structure. And again, my Cold War background, there were organizations like that. There were teams like that existed during the Cold War who were routinely trying to keep a competitive advantage. The one overarching piece of guidance I gave everybody working on re-optimization was that your touchstone here is what we're going to do going to make us more competitive. If it is, we should consider doing it. If it's not going to make us more competitive, don't waste our time. Let's focus on the need to get ahead and stay ahead against an aggressive competitor over time. And all of you who are in business understand what that's like, I think, if you're in competitive business.
You were in AT&L all 8 years as Ash.
7.5.
As the under
Close it
7.5.
up.
Andrew, were you there the whole time too?
About 4.
4. So you guys have been together for a very long time. As a part of this reorientation, aggressively posturing yourself to stay ahead of China, Russia, have you done anything to interact with industry differently, or are you trying to? What can industry do to help be more helpful in your priorities?
We've had a number of conversations about that. Let me go back to your previous question about ICC, which I didn't fully answer. ICC is the futures organization for the Air Force. There's a Space Futures Command that'll be the space organization. That'll be partly its counterpart. I'm trying to set up the type of arrangement between, in that case, the operational community, worrying about operational concepts, understanding cutting edge technology, thinking about integrated applications and those things. The ICC as a command will have a counterpart, Integrated Development Office, it will be called, in Air Force Materiel Command. And those two will work together. The IDO will generally be in support of the ICC to do what we did with the operational imperatives, form those kind of teams to attack our operational problems. And we'll also keep Tim Grayson's office in the headquarters to oversee all of this as an extension of myself and the other senior leaders. So that's sort of the structure that we're putting together. As far as industry is concerned, what industry will need to understand, I think, and start to have conversations with these groups as they stand them up. I think the biggest uncertainty for industry is who do I talk to now? Who's my customer? The structure we're setting up in the Space Force is a little more straightforward with just a single command. Those commands will not be delegated an authority to make decisions about modernization. They're going to be made at the top of the department by myself and the chiefs and the undersecretary. But those commands will be developing options for us, and they'll be doing the homework, the analytical work to ensure we're getting cost-effective options put in front of us. So they'll be very important to communicate with, so that they understand technology and where you are. And I would say in the case of the Air Force, the Space Force is very small, so their Futures Command will combine their operational and their technical people in a single organization. The Air Force, large operational community, ICC will kind of be their Futures organization, and the Integrated Development Office that I talked about in Air Force Material Command will be their technical, their arm. And the two will work together. So you're going to need to have conversations with both. We're also forming 3 centers under Air Force Materiel Command, one for nuclear capabilities, one for platforms and weapons, basically aircraft and missiles, and another for all things information, IT, cyber, C3 battle management. Those will be important organizations for you to interact with. They will be helping us ensure we have a continuous pipeline of technologies that will give us an advantage over the adversary. What we're going to try to do is be much more efficient and effective in allocating our science and technology resources, particularly when you get to the 6.3, 6.4 level, where you're doing prototyping and you're making substantial investments. There'll be more freedom basically at the earlier stages. But observation is that the S&T community has not been tied tightly enough to our modernization plans. that means we've got to be better informed by that work, and we've got to align that work with the things we're most likely to put into the field.
Any questions from the audience? I want to leave some time for that before we lose the secretary.
So, Anduril and companies like that are winning share from the traditional defense primes. What are they bringing that the traditional defense primes are not, and what advice do you have for traditional defense primes?
I think most of you probably are, this isn't gonna be a surprise. The startups are lean. They're managed in a less bureaucratic way in many cases. I've had plenty of experience with both, right? Most of my industry experience has been more with the established companies, but I've worked with some of the startups as well. Because of their small size, they're tightly integrated, they're able to make decisions in a hurry. They don't have as much bureaucracy. They're very open-minded about the sorts of things that they can propose. And they're pretty aggressive. They're hungry and they're working hard, and they're doing, in some cases, a really good job. I think, when we were only doing business with the big primes, they were responding to a lot of the bureaucracy that we imposed, quite frankly. We tried to create mechanisms for some of the startups and the newer companies to not be as burdened by some of that. I think that both communities can learn a lot from each other. There's an enormous amount of expertise on building very complex weapon systems on the side of the established companies who've been doing that generationally, year after year, decade after decade. But there's also a lot of open-mindedness and innovation present in the startup side. I really push back on people who condemn the established companies. We won the Cold War with those companies. We got the best military with those companies. And a lot of programs didn't come in as fast or as cheaply as we wanted them to. There's an inherent pressure for optimism in our system on both sides. But we provided, one of the programs that struggled a lot, the F-35, which is now the world-class multi-role fighter that everybody's buying, right? That was a good investment. It's really paying off. It was hard to get there, but we got it, and we stuck with it, and here we are. But there are a lot of other things now. As we look at the CCAs, we're going in a different direction, much simpler, different design process, if you will. And people who are using some more cutting edge are more quickly able, I think, to adopt, because they just don't have the large installed structure, if you will, more cutting edge techniques of doing design and transitioning from the design phase to the manufacturing phase. So I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, and I'm encouraging partnerships. Andrew might want to say a word or two about this, between some of the traditionals and non-traditionals. I think if we work together and are focused, I think we can do a lot of great things together, and it'll benefit everybody at the end of the day.
Hi, Michael Morrow with Breaking Defense.
Hi, Michael.
Since you alluded to the threat posed by Russia, there's a real fear here in Europe that Russia would want to make moves against NATO. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, as you approach modernization and re-optimization, does doing that with that in mind for the China challenge also handle the threat posed by Russia, even though it's two separate powers with two separate theaters?
It will handle a lot of it, but not all of it. The fact that it's largely a maritime theater in the Pacific and the distances are vast, and that the way our forces are postured relative to the adversary is fundamentally different than in Europe, right? But air superiority is air superiority. We still have to go get that. We still have to project power. We have to work jointly. We have to integrate space with other capabilities. We're going to increasingly be going in, I think, both theaters to long-range kill chains, because the threat is, one of the things the threat is doing is trying to push us further away with longer-range engagement capabilities. In Europe, you're already right on top of each other pretty much, right? You've got shared borders, basically. You've also got a much more ground-dominated thing, so support to ground forces is going to be more of a requirement, I think, in Europe than it is in the Pacific. So there are some distinctions, but there's a lot of overlap too. I don't want to get into where Russia will end up and how much of a threat they are. They're pretty well exhausting their current military in the combat in the Ukraine. They were very much surprised by what they ran into. We're all learning from that. They're learning from it too, and they're going to improve their military as a result of it. So we can't count them out. But we do have, I think, some time before they can reconstitute a military that's a serious threat to NATO. Right now, I think the strongest imperative by far is to ensure they are not successful in Ukraine. Because if they are, it's just going to embolden them to try other things. Also, it sends a message to China about our capacity, our willingness to take on aggression and defeat it. So they're not independent. There's a lot of overlap, but there are some things that are different. It's the bottom line. We're not oblivious to the needs of a theater like Europe, but that's not our highest priority right now.
Back there, and then we'll come to you next.
Brian Everson, Aviation Week
Hi, Brian.
again. There's been so much talk and speculation on the future of NGAD, how the costs and threats are driving that. I was wondering, how are the costs and threats driving discussion on your mobility cross-cutting operational enabler? How are you looking at KC-135 recap? Can you afford NGAS?
The threat is what drove us to reconsider our tanker strategy. And we announced this, I think, 2 years ago, if I remember right, that we were abandoning what was once upon a time the XYZ strategy, getting to the next generation tanker, and we're doing an analysis of alternatives right now for the next generation aerial refueling system, NGAS. That'll be wrapping up in the next few months, and then we'll be making a decision about funding a program for the next generation. Right now we have contracts, offers, basically firm offers from Boeing for KC-46s that run out in a couple of years. So the question is, if you're going to do a development of a new tanker, and it's going to take several years, what do you do in that gap? So that's something we're looking hard at. There are a couple of options there, and no final decision on that to talk about yet. But we do need to get to a next generation, more survivable, more resilient way to do the tanking mission if we can. So we're focused on getting that. We talked about the affordability issue earlier. I'm doing something that is analogous, in fact, it's very analogous to what Bill Perry did twice in his career. First time was in the 70s when Vietnam was over, money was tight. He did a lot of R&D on programs that he knew that with the current level of budget that he was experiencing in the 70s, they wouldn't be affordable in the 80s. Ronald Reagan became president, we bought those systems, and we have a lot of them still today. Bill did something very similar in the 90s, where he kept going. When the Cold War ended, we dramatically reduced defense budgets, and there was a big question mark about what to continue and what not to. I was part of that, so was Bill Perry, and we looked at programs like F-22 and decided to continue them. But we got much smaller numbers in that case, and some programs, even though we might have, the Seawolf submarines as an example, we continued the program, we funded it, but we didn't have a big increase in spending. B2 would be on that list, right? We ended up with relatively small numbers of those things. I think we're in a situation today where it's really important for Department of the Air Force to create options for increased budgets in future production at some point a few years down the road. If we don't do the work now to create those options, they won't exist. And the next administration or the one after it will be looking at a situation where it just doesn't have any ability to apply more resources and get more modern capability field because their R&D hasn't been done yet. So that's one of the things I'm trying to accomplish.
Last question.
Dave Shepard, Central Warriors. When you think about the Chinese threat and reconsidering NGAD, like what's driving your considerations? Is it sort of China's advanced technology? Is it satellites?
It's a combination of things, and I think it was mentioned earlier, it was the affordability constraints, particularly over the next several years, and the threat. The threat keeps going out to longer and longer ranges to do counter-air against all types of platforms. I told this story the other day. In 1990, I think it was, I was, Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense, and I was the Director of Tactical Warfare Programs. And we did something called the Major Aircraft Review. And the fundamental question in the Major Aircraft Review was, should we continue these programs that we started in the Cold War? They included F-22, A-12, and the B-2. And for both F-22 and the A-12, there were counterpart service versions of those aircraft that were being planned and worked on. And I ended up briefing Dick Cheney for about 8 hours on these programs. And he decided to continue them all. But he cut the inventory numbers way down. In the case of the F-22, he cut it from 600 or 700 down to 200. The threat we used to justify those aircraft The best threat, toughest threat we could find was Syria, which had a relatively modern Soviet-era air defense system, integrated air defense system, IAX. Term comes from that area. So that's what we did. We're not up against Syria today. We're up against a much, much tougher threat. One that understands that we've been doing stealth, understands our operational concepts, and one that is building a formidable set of capabilities to design us a capability to operate the way we like to operate. The penetrating counter-air mission that was the basis for the F-22 is basically the mission that's the basis, has been the basis for NGAD. When we started NGAD, that was the operational concept. The threat wasn't nearly as severe as it is now. There were no CCAs in the equation. We didn't have the shift to space that we're talking about now for relying on space functions or the need for integrated capabilities. And our weapons suite was different. So before we make a commitment to a specific NGAD concept, we want to make sure we got the right one. Now that's the exercise we're going through right now. It's a combination of affordability considerations and making sure we've optimized the operational concept that we're going to pursue. We're at the point in the program where this is kind of a one-way door. When you enter engineering, manufacturing, development, and you do milestone B, and you commit a very large amount of money to a project that's going to take you several years to field capability, you want to be pretty darn sure you got the right concept. So we're going to take a hard look before we make a commitment. That's what we're doing right now.
Great, that wraps up our time.
Thank you, everybody.
you.